Hey guys, tonight, we wander back into a world lit by flickering torchlight, where courtly love poems rustle across castle halls and portraits. In fading tapestries gaze back with calm, unfathomable eyes. You're sitting by the hearth in a manor wrapped in moss and myth, and a question lingers in the air, old as time and as deceptively simple as a sigh. What did it mean to be pretty in medieval times? Now, fair warning, you probably won't survive this beauty standard. Not unless you've got skin like milk, a forehead the size of a melon, and a diet consisting of pearls, petals, and whispered prayers. Because the ideals of attractiveness back then weren't just different, they were downright bizarre. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling cozy already, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. I love seeing who else is awake with me tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with a mirror not your own, but a polished sheet of metal in a lady's chamber. It's not perfect. It wobbles your reflection and shows you too close, too wide, too real. But back then, this was luxury. Only the elite had access to a looking glass. And even they didn't use it as you do. No selfies, no contouring, no mascara. Instead, that mirror reflected ideals shaped by religion folklore and a deeply stratified society where beauty was power, but only if it followed the rules. So let's talk about those rules. The medieval standard of beauty, especially for women, started with paleness. Not just light skin, translucent veined, nearly spectral. If your complexion looked like you'd never seen the sun, or possibly had a long-term vitamin deficiency, you were on the right track. Pale skin wasn't about aesthetics alone. It screamed wealth. It whispered, "I never work outdoors." Tanned skin, on the other hand, was for peasants, laborers, people of the fields. So noblewomen powdered their faces with lead-based concoctions, yes, lead. Just a dusting of poison to achieve the ghostly glow of aristocracy. The dangers weren't understood, or at least not acknowledged. Vanity outranked mortality. And then came the forehead. This is where things get medieval in the truest sense. A high-domed forehead was all the rage. Why? Because it was associated with intelligence, nobility, and refinement. To achieve this, some women actually plucked their hairlines. They'd take tweezers and slowly remove the front row of their hair, even into the scalp. Sometimes they'd also shave back their eyebrows entirely. The result: a forehead that looked like it could launch a ship. You imagine it now sitting before that warped mirror head, tilted methodically, plucking hairs to climb closer to heaven. Beauty hurt. Literally. Next was the body, or more accurately, what little of it anyone ever saw. Modesty was a cornerstone of Christian morality, especially in the earlier Middle Ages. Dresses were long, flowing, and layered. But even hidden under linen and wool, the preferred figure was slim with narrow hips and a small chest. Not quite the curves celebrated in later centuries. The ideal body then suggested purity, frailty, and restraint. It wasn't until the later medieval period, particularly under the influence of Italian and Burgundian courts, that a more voluptuous shape started to gain favor. Think rounded shoulders, full faces, and soft stomachs. But even then, softness wasn't meant to suggest sensuality. It signified wealth and the luxury of plentiful food. And oh, the hair. Golden was the goal. Blonde was considered divine, a color tied to angels and saints. Naturally, fair hair was rare, so women used concoctions of saffron lye and even pigeon dung to bleach their locks in the sun. They'd sit for hours with their hair plastered in homemade dye, baking in courtyards behind castle walls, all to capture that ethereal lightness. Long hair was essential too, but it was almost always hidden beneath veils, wimples, or elaborate braided styles. Hair was symbolic maidenhood, fertility, even danger. A loose head of hair was both a temptation and a threat in the eyes of the church. So most respectable women bound theirs tightly unless they were brides or saints in paintings. Lips small and red, cheeks flushed but not too much. A little beetroot juice might do the trick, but anything excessive could imply promiscuity. Eyes were best when light-colored gray, green, pale blue, all of which were prized over brown, which was seen as too earthy, too common, and the gaze downward, submissive. A pretty woman did not look directly into your soul. She glanced off to the side, modest and demure. But what's striking as you wander deeper into this medieval beauty salon is how much of it revolves around control. Control of the body, control of appetite, control of expression. Beauty was not freedom, it was discipline. A beautiful woman was not just pale and passive, she was contained. A vessel of virtue, a mirror of moral values. You picture the paintings in the chapels, Mary the Virgin always with the same delicate features, same small mouth, same downcast eyes. She was the template, the unreachable icon. And outside the church, troubadours sang of women with ivory necks and swan-like limbs. But even their poetry framed beauty as something to admire from afar, never touch, never question, just long for. So here you are, centuries later, staring into that same warbled mirror, and you realize something. What passed for beauty wasn't about looking good by today's standards. It was about signaling your place, your role, your compliance. And in that there was power but also incredible pressure. You lean in closer to the mirror and imagine your own reflection under medieval rules. Would you be beautiful? Would you be enough? Or would you reach for the tweezers? The answer, of course, lies not in the reflection, but in the next step of the journey. Because what was pretty in medieval times, that answer twists and turns through kingdoms, convents, cosmetics, and we've only just begun to trace the outline. You wake beneath a sky layered in cloud, the gray kind that diffuses sunlight into something soft, gentle, almost flattering, if only medieval women had light like this for their portraits. You rise, stretch, and return to that mental mirror, the one warped by history and vanity. It's time to wander a little deeper, not just into ideals, but into the sources that defined them. Because beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't just about appearance, it was a philosophy. And at the core of that philosophy was symmetry. From the halls of Greek antiquity, through the Roman Empire, and into the manuscripts copied by cloistered monks, the idea of proportionality endured. To be beautiful, people believed, was to be mathematically harmonious. The face was measured, the limbs aligned. Artists, philosophers, even surgeons described beauty using diagrams, divine geometry, disguised as cheekbones and chins. So imagine your face laid out as a blueprint. Forehead, nose, lips, chin, each expected to fall in line. A slightly off-center mouth. A nose just a fraction too large. In some medieval minds, this wasn't just an aesthetic flaw. It hinted at imbalance, even moral failing. Yes, you heard that right. Your looks weren't just about attractiveness. They reflected your soul. In this world, beauty and virtue were tightly bound. A lovely face suggested inner goodness, purity, obedience. A rough, asymmetrical face that could mean pride, gluttony, or worse, heresy. And woe unto the woman considered both unattractive and opinionated. That was a dangerous cocktail in an era suspicious of women's minds to begin with. You walk into the scriptorium of a medieval monastery. Illuminated manuscripts glow on the shelves. Gold leaf delicate flourishes intricate initials. And in one corner, a dusty tome contains a treatise on female perfection. You flip it open. It reads like a list of requirements for a stained glass saint. Skin like snow, hair like golden thread, eyes like clear water, lips small and coral pink, teeth like pearls, neat and even, voice soft and musical, gait light like a deer, fingers long and tapering, and always modesty in dress and behavior. That last part was crucial. You could have the perfect face, the purest skin, the finest hair, but if you laughed too loudly, or met a man's eyes too boldly, or spoke with too much confidence, the beauty became corrupted. What had been angelic became threatening, because beauty was never fully yours. It belonged to society, to the church, to your father, your husband, your community. They dictated what it meant and how it could be used. You think now of the sumptuary laws, those fascinating, fussy little rules designed to police fashion. In many parts of medieval Europe, laws were passed determining who could wear what. Gold thread only for the nobility, silk reserved for certain ranks. A woman who dressed above her station could be fined, shamed, even imprisoned. Because appearance wasn't just personal, it was political. You walk through a medieval marketplace, your cloak brushing against baskets of apples, bolts of wool, carved beads. The air smells of tallow and thyme. A young woman in modest linen passes you, her hair covered, her eyes lowered. She's lovely quietly so, but she wouldn't dare display it. To flaunt beauty was to risk ruin. Men watched, women competed, gossip swirled like dust. In a culture obsessed with chastity, a beautiful woman was both prize and peril. Men desired her. Women resented her. The church warned against her. Poets immortalized her. And often she had no say in any of it. You remember the cautionary tales, the medieval equivalent of tabloid scandals. A noblewoman who wore her gown too tight and was accused of vanity. A merchant's wife who used too much rouge and was whispered to be a harlot. A servant girl whose bright blue eyes caused the lady of the house to have her sent away. Pretty, yes, but also dangerous. In courtly romances, the medieval equivalent of pop culture, the beautiful lady was often unattainable. She inspired loyalty war madness. She was described in florid, reverent terms, but rarely did she speak. Rarely did she act. She existed to be seen, to be longed for. And this, passivity, became part of the beauty ideal. To be still, to be delicate, to be admired, not heard. You pause now as that realization settles like dust over everything you've just explored. How exhausting to be expected to be graceful, symmetrical, pale, silent, and modest all at once. How fragile the pedestal, and how sharp the fall. Still, some rebelled. There were women, quietly or boldly, who challenged the mirror, who refused to pluck their foreheads, who let their hair go dark, who dressed plainly or spoke up, or carved out space for themselves beyond beauty. You see them in the margins of those same manuscripts, the smiling women with books in their hands, or armor or pens. They weren't the pretty ones, not always, but they knew things. And knowing in its own way was a kind of rebellion. So you close the dusty tome and rise from the scriptorium bench. You step back into the market, where a new idea of beauty hums quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the next woman to break the mold. And as you continue your walk through this tangled maze of ideals and expectations, you begin to understand. In medieval times, being pretty was never just about looks. It was a performance, a balancing act, a risk. And for many women, it was a role they played to survive until they could find something deeper to claim for themselves. The next leg of your journey carries you toward the manor houses and courtly circles where beauty became ritualized. Not just practiced in private, but displayed in public, performed at banquets, on feast days, at tournaments. You pass through high iron gates and walk into the tiled courtyard of a noble estate where laughter dances from the windows and silken sleeves flutter like banners. You're entering a space where pretty takes on the shape of theater. Inside, women move like clockwork through corridors of embroidered cushions and carved paneling. Their garments rustle with calculated elegance, each layer chosen to flatter their figure, each jewel placed just so. But under that surface, strategy, survival, status. You notice first the clothing. Rich brocades in hues of crimson green and ultramarine, the kind of pigment so costly they doubled as currency. Bodices are laced tightly, not to show cleavage, but to give the impression of refinement. The neckline is wide, yes, but it reveals a pale chest and high collarbones rather than curves. The ideal remains modest, restrained. And when women walk, they glide. Every motion trained, every smile rehearsed. A beautiful woman of the court must never appear to be trying, she simply is. Effort is invisible. Labor erased. You pass through the great hall and notice the perfume, another layer of beauty not often recorded. The upper class masked the pungent odors of medieval life with oils and herbs. Lavender, rosewater, myrrh. Not overwhelming, not seductive. Just enough to imply cleanliness, wealth, and delicate sensibilities. But not all pretty things could be worn. Many had to be spoken. You watch as a lady reads aloud from a chivalric romance, her voice soft and musical. Courtly beauty wasn't just skin deep, it extended to behavior, posture, voice. The ideal woman was poetic, gentle, able to quote a verse at dinner or compose a line of prayer on the spot. Her prettiness was a performance in virtue as much as in visual appeal. You think again of the poets, the troubadours who wandered from castle to castle singing of their lady loves. They praised golden hair, rosy cheeks, and swan-like necks, but they also exalted chastity, piety, and humility. In fact, those inner virtues were considered more beautiful than any physical feature. And yet, physical beauty always crept back in, didn't it? Always framed the story. Because despite the songs, despite the sermons, beauty remained a kind of currency. A noble daughter with the right looks might fetch a better marriage alliance. Her face could mean the difference between peace and war, between riches and ruin. Pretty wasn't just personal. It was political. You sit beside a young lady as her hair is braided, 3 servants working in tandem to loop and pin the golden strands. She tells you about her upcoming betrothal, how she must appear pleasing at the presentation. Her mother instructs her to keep her smile soft, her movements slow, her voice low. Do you like the man, you ask? She pauses. I must make him like me. That is more important. Her answer stays with you. In this world, beauty is something to offer, not necessarily to enjoy. But you notice something else, too. A quiet rebellion. In the way she squeezes your hand when no one's looking. In the way she sings slightly off-key when alone. In the way she sneaks a crust of bread under the table to feed a stray dog. There's something alive under all that poise. A girl beneath the polish. Later you wander into the manor's solar where noblewomen gather to sew and gossip. Here behind the closed door and drawn curtains, a different kind of beauty emerges, less curated, less watched. Women let their veils slip, rub the rouge from their cheeks, roll their eyes at courtly expectations. One laughs. My cousin plucked her forehead so much she fainted at mass. Another scoffs. My brother says beauty is silence. I told him then he must be the ugliest man in the kingdom. You laugh with them, and for a moment beauty feels real. Lived. Flawed. Free. Then the door creaks, and in a blink the masks return. The veil slips back into place. The poses resume. Because pretty must never appear discontented. And so you leave the manor with something complicated pressing against your ribs. Pretty was power, but only if you followed the rules. Break them, and you risked everything. But in quiet corners, candlelit rooms, and shared glances between sisters, there lived a second script, a counter-performance. One that said, you can wear the gown, you can paint the face, Jewel, but beneath it all, you know who you are. And perhaps that was the prettiest thing of all. The road curves toward the countryside, now far from the polished estates and the clinking goblets of courtly life. You follow a rutted path past rows of barley and flax, past chicken coops and low stone walls dusted in moss. The world smells of soil and smoke. This is where most people lived during the medieval era, peasants, villains, cotters. And here the idea of pretty shifts again. It doesn't vanish, of course. Beauty doesn't belong solely to the rich. But in the village, pretty isn't about imported silks or imported poets. It's about something earthier, closer to survival. You pass a group of girls kneeling by a stream, scrubbing linen on smooth stones. Their sleeves are rolled to the elbow. One of them has hay tangled in her hair. Another hums a tune between her teeth. They're sunburnt, dusty, loud, and laughing. None of them would fit the courtly ideal. But there's a warmth to them, a radiance that doesn't come from powder or paint. Here to be considered pretty might mean having strong teeth, flushed cheeks from time outdoors, quick fingers, a kind laugh. It might mean being sturdy enough to lift baskets of grain or walk miles for firewood. Practical traits, useful ones. That doesn't mean vanity doesn't exist, it's just different. You spot one girl pinching her cheeks before walking past the millboy. Another adjusts her kerchief to cover a missing tooth. They notice when a neighbor's hair shines in the sun. They borrow ribbon or sew new laces to brighten old dresses. Beauty still matters here, it's just stitched into everyday things. A woman in her 30s, face lined and fingers calloused, offers you a bowl of stew. She's not what courtly painters would immortalize, but her eyes are sharp and clever. Her smile feels like a sunrise. She tells you how, when she was younger, she used to press flowers between pages and wash her face with milk and herbs to soften her skin. She says, there's no time for that now, but sometimes I still do it when I'm feeling vain. Then she laughs, a big whole-body laugh that fills the air like music. This is a different kind of pretty, not framed or fussed over, not dictated by geometry or sermons, but present all the same. You're reminded of old folk songs, ballads sung in taverns and at harvest festivals. They describe women with eyes like chestnuts, hair like wheat skin, like the bark of birch trees. Their beauty isn't otherworldly, it's familiar, earth-tethered, sometimes a little cheeky. Pretty in these stories isn't just about virtue. Sometimes it's cleverness, boldness, a spark in the eye. Still, even in the villages, expectations hover. A girl who laughed too much or climbed too high in the trees might get warned she'd never catch a husband. A woman who didn't comb her hair or speak softly could be the subject of whispered gossip. Respectability was always tangled up with appearance, no matter your class. But so was resilience. You watch as a young girl with tangled curls and bare feet walks into the field carrying a jug of water. Her stride is steady. Her face is smudged with dirt and sun. And she is glorious. No mirror tells her this. No troubadour needs to sing it. She knows it in that deep way that only comes from not having to think about it too much. And you begin to understand pretty in medieval villages wasn't a label. It was a moment. The way the wind lifted your hair just right. The way a boy grinned when you passed him bread. The way your mother told you that your eyes looked just like her sister's before she went to the war. It was not aspiration the way it was in the noble courts. It was recognition. You take a seat beneath a pear tree as the sun dips low. Children run past barefoot, shrieking with joy. A young woman sings a lullaby while braiding her sister's hair. No rouge. No plucked foreheads. No scented oils. And yet the scene is deeply, achingly beautiful. Here, beauty is not performed. It is lived. And as the bells toll from the distant chapel, you realize that in the layered quilt of medieval beauty, this patch, this small, sun-drenched village is one of the richest. Because here to be considered pretty isn't about being ideal, it's about being present. Night falls slowly over the countryside as you rise from beneath the pear tree and begin walking again, the hush of evening pressing gently against your thoughts. In the distance, candlelight flickers behind shutters, casting long, warped shadows across wattle and daub walls. You head toward the modest chapel at the center of the village where the bell tower rises like a quiet guardian above the rooftops. It's here in the dim hush of devotion that another layer of medieval beauty takes form, the spiritual ideal. Because while beauty in the Middle Ages often played out in gardens, courts, and markets, it was also shaped heavily by religion. You step inside the chapel. The air smells of wax and stone and something older, maybe reverence itself. Painted on the arched ceiling are scenes from the Bible saints in flowing robes, angels with porcelain faces and gilded halos. Their eyes are cast downward. Their hands rest against their hearts. Every figure is perfect, serene, timeless, and you begin to realize this is what generations of medieval people saw week after week. Not fashion plates, not beauty manuals, but frescoes, statues, illuminated manuscripts. The most consistent and widely available visual standard for beauty was religious art, and its message was clear. True beauty was holy, not alluring, not showy, not passionate, but pure, untouchable, untempting. Women in these depictions often shared the same features: small mouths, downcast eyes, pale skin, and softly arched brows. Their hair was hidden, their bodies shapeless beneath long robes. They were calm, obedient, distant. The Virgin Mary was the blueprint, eternally youthful, modest, emotionally restrained. You look around and notice how even the stained glass windows filter light in a way that flatters this ideal. No bold reds or sensuous purples here, just pale blues, soft golds, and milky whites. The church crafted beauty not to entice, but to cleanse. This wasn't just art. It was a psychological mold. For women especially, it set an impossible precedent. Be beautiful, but without vanity. Be pure, but admired. Be desirable, but untouched. And above all, be quiet. You remember stories passed from nunneries and convents. Letters from young women who entered religious life not out of calling, but because they were too pretty to be trusted in the world. Their beauty made them vulnerable to scandal, to marriage plots, to sin. So they were hidden, sheltered, protected, erased. Yet even within convent walls, the question lingered. What was beauty if no one was allowed to see it? And who did it belong to if not to the woman herself? You find a small wooden pew and sit for a moment watching a single candle tremble in the silence. You recall how some women turned their beauty into sanctity. Saints who were praised for rejecting suitors, refusing vanity, embracing asceticism. One tore out her own hair. Another disfigured her face with lye to avoid being married. These acts were seen not as tragic but heroic, because in this world physical beauty was always suspect. It could inspire lust, distract monks, ruin reputations, cause downfall. So the Church carved out a new definition: invisible beauty, the beauty of restraint, of humility, of denial. You step back into the cool night, the chapel behind you, the stars peeking through the clouded sky like scattered silver coins. You feel the tension between what the world admired and what the soul was meant to reject. And it makes you wonder, how did medieval women carry both burdens at once, to be visible but modest, lovely but silent, admirable but forgettable? You walk past a cloistered garden where herbs grow wild and night flowers open in the dark. A nun tending to the rosemary looks up, nods, and returns to her task. Her veil glimmers faintly in the starlight, her face peaceful, not erased, not sculpted into the Virgin Mary's mold, just present, real. And maybe this is another kind of beauty, a quiet refusal to perform, a rootedness. A woman who knows who she is, even when the world offers her only roles to play. You step onward, feet light on the gravel path, heart a little heavier with understanding, because now you see that medieval beauty wasn't just about hair color or cheekbones. It was a moral battleground, a reflection not of self, but of virtue, and often it demanded invisibility as the highest form of loveliness. Yet even in that demand, something resisted. A stray curl, a knowing glance, a woman who smiled for herself and no one else. And in that fleeting defiance, you sense the first glimmer of beauty reclaiming itself, not as an offering to the world, but as a quiet inner flame. You follow the gravel path away from the chapel and out toward the distant woods, your steps soft beneath the wide starlit sky. There's something ancient about this next stretch of your journey, something older than courtly games or village gossip, or even religious doctrine. You're headed into the realm of folk beauty, a world shaped not by the nobility or the church, but by deep-rooted superstition, oral tradition, and the wild, unknowable patterns of nature. Here among the trees and hearths of hedge witches, healers, and farm wives, pretty doesn't always mean pale or polished. It means charmed, blessed, or sometimes feared. You duck beneath low branches and step into a clearing where the moon illuminates a circle of stones. You can almost hear the stories being whispered around fires centuries ago of maidens with hair as black as ravens, or with voices so sweet they could calm a storm. In this folkloric landscape, beauty is both enchantment and danger. It's something magical, something other. One tale tells of a girl born during a thunderstorm whose eyes sparkled silver in the dark. No man dared marry her, and yet everyone who saw her dreamt of her face until the end of their days. Another story recalls a midwife with hands so delicate and fair, they were said to have been kissed by the fae, and her touch could ease pain better than any herb. These were not the blonde, soft-eyed beauties of noble courts. No, these women were often described with wild eyes, thick hair, and laughter that echoed across valleys. They were fierce, intuitive, sometimes accused of being witches, especially if they possessed too much beauty or used it too freely. In the folk imagination, beauty was a double-edged sword. A girl too pretty might bring fortune or a curse. Too lovely a voice might win a prince or call down the wrath of envious spirits. So parents braided protective herbs into their daughters' hair. Women rubbed ash on their faces during certain seasons, not to obscure their beauty, but to shield it, to hide it from wandering eyes, both human and inhuman. You enter a small cottage on the forest's edge, its hearth glowing low. An older woman sits near the fire sorting dried flowers into bundles. She's wrinkled, yes, but her face radiates strength and cleverness. Her hands are swift and sure. When she smiles, you feel it in your chest. She tells you we never looked in mirrors when the moon was full. Not if you wanted to keep your reflection. You ask her what beauty meant when she was young. She pauses. It meant the cow herd brought you apples. It meant your mother smoothed your hair with rose water. It meant your sisters asked you to lead the dance at solstice. She grins. It meant you had stories written about you before you were even old enough to understand them. In this world, beauty didn't come from cosmetics or instruction. It came from reputation, from lore. What others whispered about you in the fields. What the crone saw in your palm. What dream you walked through barefoot at dusk. There was power in being considered pretty, but also risk. A beautiful girl could become a bride. Or a ghost. You think of the warnings passed between women, don't wear red on Midsummer's Eve, or the fairies will mistake you for one of theirs. Don't comb your hair under a hawthorn tree after sundown. Don't sing near still water if you've been crying that day. All these superstitions layered over centuries shaped a kind of wild etiquette for beauty, a way to live in harmony with things unseen. Even songs, those haunting folk ballads, preserved this duality. A maiden with lips like the rose and eyes like the storm might cause a war or be carried off by the wind. A woman whose beauty made flowers bloom might also be the one to bring a village to ruin. Beauty here was never neutral. It had consequences. And yet amid all this danger and mysticism, there was a freedom too. These women didn't have to be symmetrical. They didn't have to shrink themselves to fit a saint's profile. They didn't answer to kings or bishops. Their beauty belonged to them and to the earth, the sky, the rhythms of the moon. As you leave the cottage, the old woman presses a sprig of dried lavender into your hand. For luck, she says. And as you walk beneath the canopy of ancient trees, you breathe in its scent and wonder. What would it have felt like to grow up in a world where your beauty could make you myth, where the line between pretty and powerful blurred, until no one could tell which was which? Perhaps you think that's why these stories lingered for so long. Because in a time when most women were told what beauty should look like, how it should move, dress, pray, this version offered something rare. The chance to be beautiful on your own terms. Even if it frightened the world around you. You emerge from the woods just as dawn stretches across the sky, painting the treetops with soft gold. The scent of dew clings to the grass beneath your feet. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, and smoke begins curling from the chimneys of village hearths. The world is waking up again, and with it your journey presses forward, this time toward the rigid stone walls of education, record-keeping, and prescription, the medical and scholarly definitions of beauty. Because yes, even the medieval physicians had opinions about what made a woman pretty. And they wrote them down. You enter a small monastic infirmary where the shelves are lined with leather-bound tomes. You run your fingers over the ridged spines of books like Trotula, a collection of texts on women's health that circulated widely in the 11th and 12th centuries. It's named after a female physician, yes, female Trotula of Salerno, a woman who dared to write authoritatively in a world that rarely listened to women's voices. She and others didn't just write about illness. They wrote about beauty, what caused it, how to preserve it, what it meant. You leaf through a manuscript and find recipes for skin creams made from rose oil and goat fat, advice for lightening freckles with crushed lily root, tips for keeping the breath sweet and the armpits fragrant using rosemary-infused water. And beneath all of it is the same quiet message: beauty is not just fate, it can be managed, engineered, restored. But the medical texts didn't stop there. They often linked physical appearance to health and character. Pale skin, a sign of good blood and noble temperament. Red, flushed cheeks, youthful energy, but too much might suggest lustfulness or overindulgence. Excessive hair, a sign of imbalance or even impurity. A high, rounded forehead, intellectual superiority. Small, moist eyes, a delicate nature. Large eyes, possibly seductive. It sounds absurd now judging inner worth by outer form, but it was taken seriously. Appearance in many ways was a diagnosis, and so a woman's beauty could become her medical chart. In an era where most people couldn't read or write, and where mirrors were rare and expensive, much of this beauty knowledge had to be passed down by word of mouth. Midwives, herbalists, mothers, and older sisters quietly arrested younger girls. Don't drink too much wine, it heats the blood and dulls the eyes. Wash your face with morning dew if you want to stay youthful. Never frown at a full moon, it'll leave wrinkles. You visit a nearby bathhouse, one of the few in the region, and watch women soaking in warm, herb-scented water. They scrape their skin gently with curved metal tools. They trade secrets about elderflower balms and almond oil masks. A noblewoman and a brewer's daughter sit side by side, their status briefly erased by the steam. Here, beauty isn't about class, it's about ritual. And while some of these practices are harmless, even comforting, others begin to trouble you. The way certain body types were declared ideal and others pathological. The way a scar or a limp or a birthmark could cast suspicion on a woman's moral or spiritual fitness. In medieval medical theory, beauty wasn't just a gift. It was proof that the body was in balance, the soul in harmony, the blood of noble lineage. Ugly then became synonymous with unwell, with unworthy. And this equation made it easy for society to marginalize women who didn't conform. The poor, the sick, the disabled. They were pushed further from the idea of pretty not just because of bias, but because of pseudoscience. You think of the girls born with physical differences, one leg shorter than the other, or a birthmark across the cheek, or a curved spine. What were they told about their worth? How were they expected to navigate a world where beauty wasn't just cosmetic, but moralized? The truth settles heavy in your chest. Beauty was never just adornment. It was a measurement system, a way to sort women, to determine their fate, to justify who deserved tenderness, respect, marriage status, and who didn't. And yet even within these rigid texts and sterile apothecaries, women found ways to reassert control. They altered the recipes, swapped the herbs, invented their own rituals, shared stories over hot water and combs and candlelight. They reminded one another quietly that while the men might write the books, women still wrote the mirror. You step back outside the early morning sun, now warming the stones beneath your feet. Somewhere a girl rinses her face with river water. A mother combs tangles from her daughter's hair while humming an old tune. A widow smooths her sleeves and decides not to cover the scar on her neck today. And as you continue your walk, you begin to see medieval beauty not as a fixed image, but as a living, breathing negotiation between doctrine and desire, between expectation and instinct, between the world's gaze and a woman's own reflection. By midday, you find yourself walking through the gates of a bustling medieval town. The streets are alive with motion vendors shouting their wares, chickens darting between cartwheels, the clang of a smith's hammer echoing from the far end of a narrow lane. It's a different energy than the quiet of the village or the hush of the monastery. Here beauty is on display, but not in the polished, orchestrated way of a noble court. This is urban beauty shaped by tradecraft and 1,000 shifting eyes. You pass women in wool dresses dyed with madder and wode their aprons dusted with flour, their cheeks flushed, not with rouge, but with the heat of labor. Some balance baskets on their heads, others haggle over ribbons and mirrors imported from Venice. In a world before billboards and glossy portraits, a woman's appearance in a public marketplace spoke volumes. Pretty didn't just mean pleasing, it meant strategic. You duck into a clothier's stall and listen as a merchant discusses which fabrics make the best impression at weddings and feast days. Red for passion, he says. Green for good fortune. But blue is for piety, and it looks dear on pale skin. He looks you up and down, already calculating what shade might flatter you best, not just in the mirror, but in society's mirror. In the city, beauty is commercial. Not just seen, it's sold. You watch as a girl picks out a pair of jeweled pins from a traveling goldsmith. She doesn't need them for function. Her hair is already braided. But these pins sparkle, and when she places them just behind her ears, you see her entire posture shift. She stands taller, smiles wider. Because even in a time of hardship, plague and toil, beauty had the power to make a woman visible. That visibility could open doors. A well-dressed woman might land a better position as a merchant's assistant. A woman praised for her good looks might marry into a higher guild. A young maid with symmetrical features might be chosen as the face of a seasonal festival or local pilgrimage. And of course, with visibility came scrutiny. In the urban setting, women had to navigate a labyrinth of watchful gazes, market guards, priests, employers, jealous neighbors. Smile too much and you're flirtatious. Not enough and you're cold. Dress too fine and you're vain. Too plain and you're forgettable. It was a daily balancing act, one that women learned to perform expertly. You visit a scribe's shop tucked beside a tavern where young women are learning to read basic Latin and keep ledger books. Their hair is bound back, fingers stained with ink. One of them jokes about how the merchant's son only compliments her penmanship when she wears her green overdress. And you realize beauty in this space isn't ornamental. It's adaptive, a tool, a disguise, a stage costume, but also sometimes a comfort. Later you stop by a small bathhouse on the edge of the city. It's cozier than the one you visited in the village. Less structured. Women gossip freely here as they scrub and steam, sharing news recipes and beauty remedies. One woman teaches another how to mash dried rose petals into soap. Another recommends soaking your hair in nettle water for shine. A third scoffs, saying just wear a headscarf. Works better than any potion. They laugh, loud, unafraid, alive. You notice something beautiful that has nothing to do with looks. It's confidence. Not the kind born from flattery or approval, but the kind shaped by endurance. These women know their city. They know its rhythms, its smells, its dangers and delights. They walk its streets not to be seen, but to live. And in doing so, they radiate a beauty no painter could fully capture. You sit for a while beneath the overhang of a cooper's shop, watching the people pass. A woman argues over the price of bread, hands on her hips, hair escaping her braid in defiant spirals. Another sings softly to a baby strapped to her back. Another fixes a torn hem with teeth clenching a needle. This too is beauty. not in stillness, but in motion, in voices raised, in sweat and dirt and thunderous spirit. Because sometimes to be pretty in a medieval city didn't mean being delicate. It meant being present, unyielding, known by name in the street, feared by fools, praised by friends. And as dusk drapes itself over the rooftops and the town begins to settle, you walk a little slower. The echoes of city life fade into warmth, and you begin to understand something new. Urban beauty was never passive. It was a conversation between body and environment, self and society. And the women who shaped it, they weren't waiting to be painted. They were writing themselves in. As night returns and the streets empty of the day's clamor, you follow a narrow path out of the town and toward the edges of nobility. Again, not to the soaring halls of royal courts this time, but to the quieter domains of the noble household, where beauty lived behind draped tapestries and candlelit embroidery, chambers and garden walks and mirrored sighs. This world refined, enclosed, intentional adds yet another layer to the medieval notion of prettiness. Because here, beauty was not only seen or practiced, it was curated. You enter through a side gate into the herb garden of a small, noble estate. Lavender and sage line the beds. A fountain trickles softly in the center. In a gazebo beneath the ivy, a young noblewoman sits, chin resting on her hand, while a maid combs her long, honey-blonde hair. The air smells of lemon balm and distant music. Everything here feels slower, controlled, as if every moment is being prepared for someone's eyes. Because within noble families, especially those with ambition, a daughter's beauty was a portfolio. Her appearance was part of the estate's future, an asset in the ledger, a face that could seal an alliance silence, a rival attract a dowry. The pressure was intense even if it came wrapped in lace. You're ushered inside through halls lined with family crests and portraits. One of the ladies of the house invites you to observe the daughters as they study manners, posture drills, gentle speech lessons, how to lower the eyes without seeming coy, how to smile with modesty but not too much warmth, how to hold a fan, how to bow kneel walk always with grace. And behind it all, the unspoken truth, beauty isn't for you. It's for them, the guests, the lords, the judges, the matchmakers. In these households, girls learned from an early age that being pretty wasn't just about pleasing the eye, it was about controlling perception. You had to be flawless, but also effortless, intelligent, but never boastful, polished, but not proud. You sit with a girl named Isolde as she applies a thin mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites to her face, an old trick for evening the skin tone. She explains it with a sigh. If you're too pretty, they say you must be vain. If you're not pretty enough, they forget you entirely. There's a weight in her voice. You realize she's 16 and already preparing for her second betrothal attempt. The first fell through because the visiting nobleman found her too serious for his tastes. As she speaks, she fiddles with a small mirror. You watch her tilt it left, then right, searching for approval in the angles of her own reflection. And it hits you, beauty in this place isn't just a trait. It's a performance under surveillance, even when no one's watching. Yet within this pressure, there are moments of rebellion. You overhear one girl mutter that she prefers the stable boy's crooked grin to the painted gestures of her tutor. Another confides she'd rather spend her mornings tending herbs than reciting poetry for some duke's cousin. A third hides a small sketch she made of herself, not idealized but honest. Freckles, round nose, strong chin, a face she recognizes as hers. There's defiance in these moments, quiet, flickering, and real. You walk through the solar where older women embroider while speaking in hushed tones about beauty then versus now. One remembers when long eyebrows were the rage. Another recalls smearing elderberry juice on her lips behind her governess's back. They laugh bittersweet at how many hours they lost worrying about their necklines or the tilt of their brows. They don't dismiss beauty, but they don't worship it either, not anymore. And you wonder if that's what time does. It sands down the sharp edges of beauty's demands, turns obsession into memory, turns performance into perspective. Outside again, you watch the noble daughters gather in the garden after supper, lanterns bobbing gently in their hands. One of them begins to sing a simple tune, untrained, imperfect, but utterly her own. The others join in their voices, overlapping like woven thread. No courtiers, no mirrors, no rules. Just the moonlight, the song, and the wind lifting the hems of their dresses. And for a moment, you glimpse the beauty they never get to show the world. The one that's unpolished, unperformed, uncompromised. Because even in a world that tried to make them ornaments, these girls were still human, laughing, yearning, aching to be seen in a way that didn't involve calculation. And you begin to realize medieval prettiness wasn't a single face or style or attitude. It was a story told differently in every setting. And in places like this, underneath the silk and formality and curtsied expectations, you could still find the real girl breathing beneath the mask, if only someone remembered to look. Morning breaks anew as you drift farther from the noble estate, past the hedgerows and low stone fences into open fields threaded with mist and birdsong. This time your path veers towards something more elusive, less anchored in appearance, and more in reputation. Because in medieval times, beauty didn't always depend on the curve of your face or the shine of your hair. Sometimes what made a woman pretty wasn't how she looked at all. It was how others spoke about her. You walk into a roadside tavern, its wooden sign creaking on rusted hinges. Inside, the fire is low, the benches worn smooth, and the air smells of mead and damp wool. This is where the oral history of beauty lives, not in portraits or poems, but in stories. Passed over bread, whispered across tables, sung after the third mug of ale. You hear a bard tuning a lute in the corner, his voice warming with each chord. When he begins to sing, the room quiets, not because the song is about war or saints or kings, but because it's about her. Marion of the Mill, he sings with hands that wove like spiders, lips red as crushed cherries, and a gaze sharp enough to slice through lies. No one in the room asks what Marion looked like exactly. They don't need to. Her reputation is her prettiness now, her cleverness, her strength, her mystery, the way she stood up to the merchant who tried to cheat her father. The way she could drink any man under the table and still walk home straight. The way she refused 3 proposals not because she was proud, but because she hadn't yet been impressed. You notice how everyone listens, how the women nod, how the men glance at the door as if she might still walk in. And you understand beauty in this context is earned through action, through defiance, through story. You sit at the back of the tavern as a farmer leans in to tell you about a girl from his village who once wrestled a sheep thief to the ground in her wedding dress. Prettiest thing I ever saw, he chuckles. Another man swears his cousin's wife had the kind of smile that could stop a bishop mid-sermon. None of them describe cheekbones, or waistlines, or hair color. They describe moments, impressions, a flash of wit, a surprising strength, a kindness so fierce it felt like bravery. You begin to realize that for many medieval people, especially those who lacked wealth titles or formal education, beauty wasn't something you possessed. It was something you left behind. A woman could be considered beautiful not because she met an ideal, but because she was unforgettable. Even if her teeth weren't straight. Even if her hands were rough from work. Even if she ever owned a single ring or combed her hair with anything finer than river water. Her story carried her, and those stories rippled outward, becoming songs, warnings, jokes, compliments. She's no Marion someone might whisper about a bride who seemed too quiet. Or she's got the fire of Mered the cobbler about a girl who argued with the baker. This kind of beauty couldn't be painted. It couldn't be powdered or pinned or purchased. It was lived, out loud. You step back into the daylight and make your way toward a village square where a festival is underway. Ribbons flutter. Laughter bursts like birds into the air. And in the middle of it all, women of every age, shape, and shade are dancing freely without pretense. They aren't here to impress. They're here to belong. And you think maybe this was the truest prettiness of all in the medieval world. Not the kind that froze you like a statue or narrowed you into a mold, but the kind that moved, that lived in story and gesture and memory. You pass a young girl skipping rope with her friends. She has a missing tooth and wild curls and the loudest laugh in the square. An old woman nearby chuckles, nudges her neighbor, and says, "That one'll have songs written about her someday." And just like that, a legend begins. Because in this time, more than makeup, more than posture, more than paint, it's the echo of a person that people remember. Not how she sat, but how she showed up. The sun begins to dip again, casting long shadows over the thatched roofs of the village as you follow the winding road toward the farmlands. Your feet are dusted with earth, your thoughts heavy with everything you've seen, beauty as prayer, as rebellion as storytelling. But out here on the quiet edges of society, another kind of beauty ruled, the practical kind. The kind that didn't need a mirror. The kind that showed up at dawn and didn't sit down until the moon was high. You pass rows of wheat bending in the breeze. A woman stoops low to harvest the heads of grain with swift, practiced movements. Her dress is plain, her hair wrapped in cloth, her face turned away from the road, and yet there is a grace to her motion, a rhythm that speaks of muscle memory and purpose. In medieval times, this was the most common face of womanhood, and in many ways the most ignored by beauty's traditional standards. Peasant women, laboring wives, field-hardened mothers, they rarely appeared in illuminated manuscripts or courtly poems. They were the infrastructure of daily life. The ones whose hands planted, scrubbed, lifted, soothed, whose lives left no portrait, only footprints. But that didn't mean they weren't seen as beautiful. You make your way toward a communal well, where several women are gathered, filling buckets and chatting softly. One is missing a few teeth, but has a smile that makes the others laugh with their whole bodies. Another has deep lines etched around her eyes, not from frowning, but from squinting into the sun every day to check on her family's livestock. A third woman, lean and tall, carries 2 full pails without a tremble in her arms. A passing boy calls her the prettiest oak in the forest, and no one questions it. Because out here, beauty wasn't about perfection, it was about function, vitality, and resilience. A strong back was beautiful. Calloused hands were beautiful. A body that could carry wood, knead dough, give birth, and keep moving was beautiful. Sure, girls in the countryside still braided ribbons in their hair on feast days. They traded salves and recipes. They shared charms for keeping skin soft or teeth white. But these rituals were small, woven into labor, not replacements for it. You listen as a grandmother tells her granddaughter, "The best beauty tonic is a day of honest work and a good night's rest." The girl rolls her eyes, but she stores the words away. You can see it. Here, prettiness wasn't performative. It was proven. By dusk, you walk through a pasture where two sisters are racing to bring in the last of the goats before dark. They're barefoot, laughing, panting mud streaked on their dresses. Their hair flies behind them like wind-whipped flags. No corsets, no makeup, just life. And for a moment, you realize how deeply disconnected the usual medieval beauty standards were from reality. How they excluded the majority of women who couldn't afford stillness, let alone face creams made of swan fat and pearl dust. But within their own communities, these women weren't invisible. They were cherished, praised for their endurance, their cleverness, their ability to make 5 onions and a crust of bread feed a family of 6. Celebrated not with ballads, but with trust, with reliance, with the quiet knowing that if they vanished, the entire village would unravel. You think of how often beauty today is defined by fragility, porcelain skin, waifishness, delicacy, and then you think of the peasant women, how durable they had to be, how hard they loved, how fiercely they survived. Maybe prettiness in their world was measured by how many people leaned on you, by how often someone said, "Ask her, she'll know what to do," by how many lives you held together without ever being thanked for it. As the stars blink into view overhead, you pass a low cottage where a woman sits by candlelight, spinning thread from raw wool. She hums to herself nothing fancy, just a tune that's lived in her family longer than her name. You don't need to ask if she was ever considered pretty. You know the answer. Not by society's narrow rules, but by the people who counted. Her children, her neighbors. The man who walks 3 miles every Sunday just to bring her wildflowers from the marsh. And in that flickering firelight, with the hum of her spindle and the strength of her silhouette, you see it clearly. There was no greater beauty in medieval times than a woman who endured. Not quietly, but completely. The stars hang heavy now, scattered across the velvet sky as you leave the farmland behind. The road winds upward toward the hills where silence rules and the wind carries only the faint sounds of nocturnal creatures. And here in this hush you arrive at one final expression of medieval beauty, one that rarely made it into the records, but lived in the margins, in the shadows, in the spaces between all the rules. Because there were women always who didn't fit, who weren't daughters waiting to be married, wives waiting to be praised, peasants waiting to be worked, or noble girls waiting to be chosen. These were the outsiders, and sometimes they were the most beautiful of all. You come upon a tiny hermitage half swallowed by ivy, nestled at the edge of a wooded bluff. Smoke curls from the chimney. The door is ajar. Inside, a woman of indeterminate age tends a pot of soup, her back turned. She wears no ornament, no veil, no polish, and yet her posture radiates self-sufficiency. You feel in her presence a strange calm, a magnetic stillness. She's not a nun, not quite a healer, not quite a recluse, just separate. Once long ago, she might have been called a wise woman, or a holy woman, or if things had gone poorly, a witch. And her beauty, it doesn't beg for notice, it refuses it. She sits across from you without ceremony and offers you a bowl. Her face is lined with age and sun and grief. Her eyes are not bright, they are deep. You look into them and feel the weight of someone who has nothing to prove, who left the marketplace long ago, who stopped waiting to be seen. This is a kind of beauty medieval society didn't know what to do with. It didn't flatter. It didn't flirt. It existed, and that was enough. As you sip the soup, you ask her quietly if she ever worried about being pretty. She smiles at you genuinely gently. Of course. When I was a girl, I wanted braids like my cousins and skin like the queen's. I wanted to be painted in someone's song. She stirs the pot again. Then I stopped. I realized I'd rather grow herbs than husbands. And she did. She tells you stories of walking alone in the woods for hours, of delivering babies when the midwife failed to arrive, of being called a demon and an angel in the same breath by different men, of learning to love herself through silence, not praise. You begin to see there was a kind of transcendent beauty in the medieval world that didn't depend on society at all. A beauty outside the village square, outside marriage contracts, outside the balance of the four humors and the color of your linen. A woman like this could have been feared or revered, but rarely understood. And yet her beauty was unmistakable in her stillness, her self-possession, the way her life glowed without ever being lit by someone else's approval. You think of other women like her, ones who wandered the roads, as pilgrims who built shrines in forest clearings, who stayed unmarried, not out of resistance but because they found something more beautiful in solitude, something that belonged entirely to them. You remember how the church both venerated and distrusted female mystics, how women who saw visions or heard voices were sometimes canonized and sometimes burned. Because beauty like this raw, spiritual, detached, was unpredictable. It couldn't be used, and that made it powerful. As you step outside, the wind pulls at your cloak, and you look out across the rolling hills. The moon casts a silver path over the grass. Somewhere down there are girls still trying to mirror a queen's silhouette. Wives scrubbing dishes, widows with combs in their pockets, midwives lighting candles, daughters preparing themselves for introductions they didn't ask for. And here above them all, a woman who simply is. You begin to understand that beauty in the medieval sense wasn't always about belonging. Sometimes it was about becoming. And in that moment, in the clean hush of night, you can almost believe that this kind of beauty, so rarely seen, so rarely named, was perhaps the most liberating of all. Because it didn't require you to be watched. It only asked that you see yourself and not look away. The moonlight guides you gently back down the hillside, your thoughts brimming with every face, every form of beauty you've encountered. But there's still one place left to visit on this winding journey, a space where ideas were copied, debated, preserved, and quietly shaped by minds few ever saw. A monastery. And in its echoing halls, cloistered behind thick walls and thicker silence, lived yet another kind of medieval woman. The scribes, the nuns, the scholars, and with them a beauty that was neither worn nor spoken, but written. You enter through a side gate before dawn, when the world is still gray and the chapel bells have yet to toll. Inside, everything is hushed. Stone corridors swallow sound, and candlelight pools in quiet corners, where parchment rustles beneath practiced hands. At a desk by the window, a nun dips her quill into ink. Her veil slips slightly, revealing a flash of gray hair at her temple. She doesn't notice. She's too focused, too deep inside the world of her manuscript, her lips moving silently with the words she copies. She's not painting saints. She's copying medical texts, philosophical arguments, even poetry. Somewhere in this very monastery, the idea of what was pretty was debated and sometimes challenged on vellum. You find a small library tucked behind a carved wooden door, shelves packed with volumes in Latin, Greek, and French. In one, you find a copy of De Amore, a 12th century treatise on courtly love by Andreas Capellanus. You skim passages that lay out the rules of attraction, the perfect proportions of the face, the behavior of a lady worth pursuing, and in the margins tiny, elegant notes written by a woman's hand. This is foolish, one says. Only a man would think love must be earned through torment, reads another. You realize behind the cloister's silence, resistance lived. Nuns, though bound to celibacy and uniformity, often had sharp minds and sharp tongues. Many had once been noble daughters educated before being given to the church. Some arrived by choice, others by necessity, and inside their enclosure they created a parallel beauty, one defined by intellect, insight, discipline, and yes, at times, joy. You meet a sister named Beatrice who shows you an illuminated psalter she's been working on. The borders are alive with color flowers, vines, tiny animals. God made the world lovely, she tells you. Why shouldn't our books be too? Her fingers are stained with ink and powdered pigment. Her nails are chipped. Her eyes are bright. And she glows not because she is trying to attract anyone, but because she is devoted to craft, to contemplation, to clarity of mind. It strikes you that in this world, beauty had nothing to do with pleasing others. It was about pleasing the divine. The sisters believed that a beautiful thought, a beautifully copied word, a beautifully lived life, these were more lasting than youth skin or hair. They saw the soul as a canvas, and their work silent, slow, sacred as the brushstroke. And yet, even here vanity found its way in. Beatrice giggles and confesses that when she was 16, she shaved her forehead to look more noble, and regretted it for months. Another sister admits she used to sneak honey from the kitchen to use as a face mask before feast days, because no matter how holy the space, they were still human, still curious, still tethered to the longing to be admired, even if only by their own reflection in a bowl of water. You walk with them through the cloister garden. The air is thick with rosemary and thyme. One of the older nuns hums as she prunes the lavender. We are like the herbs, she says, not always showy, but useful, fragrant, lasting. You begin to understand their beauty was not about appearance. It was about presence, a clear mind, a steady hand, a heart uncluttered by spectacle. And in a world where women's voices were so often muted, these nuns carved space for themselves through scholarship, through prayer, through careful, invisible rebellion. You exit the monastery just as the bells ring for prime. The sky is pale with morning. Birds flit across the garden wall. And behind you, the sound of a quill scratching continues steady, eternal. Beauty here will never be sung in a tavern or painted in oils, but it will endure. In footnotes, in ink, in wisdom passed from hand to hand. And as you descend toward the next bend in your journey, you hold tightly to that truth. Not all beauty had to be seen to shape the world. Some beauty whispered and changed everything. The road begins to flatten now, the air warmer, thicker, the sky blooming with hints of dusk. As you descend toward the final stretches of your journey, your feet bring you to a place few history books care to describe, the thresholds of medieval love and intimacy. The places where desire, judgment, shame, and longing met in tangled silence. Because if prettiness in medieval times was a kind of currency, then nowhere was its price more sharply felt than in the private rooms and public gossip that surrounded marriage, fertility, and sexuality. You come to a quiet village on the edge of a forest where smoke drifts lazily from crooked chimneys and an old woman sits spinning flax on her porch. She nods toward the communal green. They've chosen the May Queen, she says with a smirk. You make your way to the clearing where ribbons dangle from a tall pole and garlands crown the heads of girls in white linen. One of them is being led forward by a cluster of giggling friends, roses in her hair, cheeks flushed not with rouge, but nerves. Her role isn't just symbolic. In this moment, she embodies idealized femininity, fertility, virtue, bloom. But behind the celebration lies tension. Because prettiness in this context is no longer a game. It has stakes. In medieval society, a woman's desirability was tightly bound to her perceived moral worth. Pretty might open doors, but too pretty, too forward, too alluring. That could damn you. A maiden praised for her beauty today might be whispered about tomorrow. The line between admiration and accusation was razor thin. You walk behind the green where older girls watch the festivities with a mix of envy and dread. One of them leans close and murmurs, "They say the prettiest girls never marry well. Men want to look at you, not keep you." Another laughs bitterly, "Unless you're rich. Then they'll forgive a pretty face for nearly anything." You begin to see that prettiness at this stage in a woman's life was not just celebrated, it was scrutinized, even weaponized. You visit a local midwife known for her discretion and skill. Her home is lined with bundles of herbs, mugwort, yarrow, rue. She lets you listen in as she prepares a poultice and speaks softly to a young bride. "You're not just a wife now," she says. "You're a vessel. They'll measure you by what you produce." And just like that, beauty's purpose narrows again. Now it's not about attracting a husband. It's about pleasing one. Producing heirs, aging slowly, remaining desirable in a world that offered women few second chances. You see it in the almanacs and household guides tucked into village chests, advice on keeping skin smooth with goose fat, maintaining rosy cheeks, with beet juice masking, body odor, with vinegar-soaked cloth. These weren't luxuries. They were survival tools. A woman who let herself go risked neglect, rumors, replacement. Yet not all was repression. You walk the back roads at twilight and pass couples speaking in hushed tones beneath trees. A shepherd's daughter kisses a tanner's apprentice. A widow laughs openly at a farmer's compliment. For all the rules, people still reached for beauty as joy, not just transaction. You hear songs carried on the breeze, songs about eyes like the sea, hands like silk, a smile that ruined a man's sleep. And you smile because despite the constraints, medieval people still loved beauty, craved it, sought it out in stolen moments and quiet rebellion. In the fields beyond, you find a stone carved with a heart and initials weathered half-lost to moss. A forgotten love, maybe, a declaration that once shimmered in candlelight and passion. It reminds you that beauty in all its forms often left no legacy but memory. You sit beneath a tree and consider the women whose prettiness had been praised and punished, celebrated and censured. How they learned to modulate themselves too bold, and they were dangerous, too quiet, and they were invisible. How some used beauty like armor, others like bait, and others still not at all. Because ultimately, prettiness didn't belong to them. It belonged to the eyes that judged it, the hands that claimed it, the words that distorted it. And yet, you think of the girl, crowned May Queen, clutching her garlands, the midwife whose lined face no one would call pretty, but who held the secrets of generations in her palms, the quiet lovers, the secret songs. And you know beauty lived not just in appearances, but in refusal, in choice, in quiet power. As stars begin to pierce the sky once more, yet you feel a shift in your step, a softness, a reverence. Because you now understand to be pretty in medieval times wasn't just about being seen. It was about surviving the gaze, and sometimes outliving it. The wind rises gently now, brushing over the quiet fields and tugging at the edges of your cloak. You follow the final stretch of the old Roman road toward a forgotten hilltop shrine, a place whispered about by travelers where people once came to pray not for salvation, but for beauty. Not the eternal kind, the earthly kind. You climb past leaning stones and fading frescoes, past offerings left in alcoves, wilted flowers, braided ribbons, dried apples. A carved plaque over the arch reads barely legible for grace, for light, for favor. It was once believed this shrine could make a woman lovelier, that a single prayer here whispered with enough sincerity could turn a plain face radiant or preserve fading youth. Some brought mirrors to leave behind sacrifices of vanity. Others came barefoot, weeping, begging to be noticed, desired, wanted. It strikes you as deeply human and deeply tragic. Because now, after everything you've seen, the abbesses, the shepherd girls, the courtly ladies, the rebels, the scribes, you know beauty was never about fairness. It was about power, about proximity to it, about who decided what was lovely and who got crushed by that judgment. But you also know that prettiness was not a fixed thing. It was fluid. It changed from town to town, from decade to decade, from one pair of eyes to another. It could mean golden hair in one story, olive skin in another. It could mean silence, or wit, or hips wide enough to bear sons, or a spine straight enough to bear secrets. And you think of all the girls who measured themselves against impossible ideas, who plucked, pinched, prayed, and punished themselves in the name of being seen. Some succeeded, some didn't. But every one of them felt it, the weight of beauty's promise. The lie that prettiness was safety, that if you were lovely enough, your life would be better, softer, chosen. But beauty was never armor. It was invitation. And sometimes it brought danger instead of comfort. You reach the altar at the shrine's center. Time has smoothed its edges, but the indent where people once knelt remains. You lower yourself into it, touch the stone, and think of how many hopes, fears, and names are embedded in its silence. And then you think of the ones who defied it, the women who refused to be summed up by cheekbones, the ones who found beauty in thought, in labor, in solitude, the ones who never asked to be called pretty and still glowed, the ones whose legacy wasn't a reflection, but a ripple. And as your eyes close, you understand the deepest truth of all. In medieval times, prettiness was never the whole story. It was a flicker, a phase, a performance that faded, but character that stayed. Kindness left echoes. Wisdom changed lives. And presence, true, unapologetic presence, could make even the most ordinary face unforgettable. So if you were a woman in that world, walking your own path, perhaps the prettiest thing you could do was endure it all and still remain yourself. Still laugh, still love, still look up at the sky like it belonged to you. Because in a world that tried to define your worth by how well you fit someone else's dream, the most beautiful act of all was simply being real and refusing to disappear. Now let your breathing slow. You're no longer wandering cobbled streets or peeking into thatched cottages. The bells of distant monasteries have quieted. The candles are burned low. The ink has dried in the margins. And wherever you are, whether curled under blankets or resting beneath a soft fan, you can let it all fade. All those faces, those whispered prayers for beauty, those ancient mirrors are behind you now. The world you walked tonight was one of struggle, softness, and strength, of women who knew the cost of prettiness and still found power in it, or beyond it. So many of them never had their stories written down. They lived, they worked, they worried, they wondered, and then they vanished into time. But now for a little while you've remembered them. You gave them breath again. You honored their complexity. You don't need to carry it anymore. You can let the night take it. Let your muscles soften. Your jaw unclench. Your thoughts drift. Maybe to a stone altar covered in moss. Maybe to a girl dancing with a ribbon. Maybe to a face, any face that reminds you of your own. You are safe now, and you've made it through another day. Whatever kind of beauty you carry, it's enough. You don't need to be seen, or approved of, or compared. You just need to rest. So go ahead. Let sleep take you.